Ah, thank you very much for this kind introduction. Welcome, everybody. We will be presenting two projects we have been working on for quite some time now, a special issue titled Rethinking Economic Planning and an edited volume titled Creative Construction. After presenting these two projects, we will use the closing remarks to highlight some topics that we believe to be of importance for the planning debate in the years to come in order to stimulate discussion. And Christoph is actually taking over for part two, the presentation of Rethinking Economic Planning, a special issue with competition and change.
Thank you very much. My Google has just kind of failed, so I need to restart. It's going to take 10 seconds. That may actually give me the chance, because I think Jan was too modest to say that he has in the meantime finished his PhD. Congratulations to Jan.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, it's a very
I'm really relieved, I have to say.
Yeah. It's nice to kind of see what happened in the meantime since we sent this bio, right? Okay, so yes, this has worked now. Okay, so I have my notes. So I'll start with the special issue, which is basically, I just want to say a couple of things about it. I don't want to summarize the whole introduction either. I'll just say a couple of things. So basically, the introduction has been sort of accepted with some very minor revisions. So the special issue is basically finished. All of the other papers have either been accepted or declined. So you can look them up online. A lot of them are open access. If not, you know what to do if you don't have a university account. Yes. So I'll just say, and this is not to brag, this is just to say that the topic of planning has been really popular. I double checked. It's basically every single article of the special issue is in the most read section of Competition and Change. Competition and Change is a very good journal, so we are very happy about that. I just had had to send out a couple of research grant proposals to have a job next year also, because the German neoliberal university system is broken. So it was quite a bunch of grant proposals, but so for all of them, the topic of democratic planning has been accepted as an important one, as something that it's okay to do academia on, which I didn't think was necessary. I didn't assume that would happen 2 years ago, so I'm very happy about that as well. I think that's a good development, and the special issue is kind of embedded in a broader attempt, not only by us, but also by other people, to turn this into a sort of acceptable academic topic in the politics of academia. That's not all we want to do, but it's part of it. I think it's important for two reasons, because first of all, a lot of the people in the planning debate, the ones who are academics, they're recent graduates or master students or PhD candidates or early postdocs, and it's hard to survive in academia in a lot of countries in those years. And planning becoming an acceptable topic means they can continue their work. It means that there are generally more resources if you have research projects that can be devoted to the planning debate. All of that is good. Yes, it also means that the topic can be referenced. It appears on the radar of established researchers. They become aware of this being a topic, and they kind of internalize that this is a good topic to research. So this is the kind of politics of academia side, although of course we'll always have to keep in mind that the much more important struggles like fought elsewhere, but still this is important. Yes. So Jan, could you turn to the next slide, please? Yes. So this is very roughly just a suggestion on how to kind of chronologically think about the socialist calculation about the history. I think you had a whole session on this. We don't want to kind of repeat all of the history, but this is from the introduction. I think they didn't want the table, but it's kind of what we write in this first section of the introduction. I guess we can interpret the new interest in planning as a fourth wave. of the socialist calculation debate. The chart would be an illustration and a suggestion of how we could interpret these waves. So we have this first wave that we mostly think of this debate between Norad and Mises and others about the possibility of socialist calculation, about the issue that we now talk more of, the commensurability of values. We have this exchange of mostly Lange and Hayek, but also of others, that shifts the terrain to computation and knowledge, with then most mainstream economists interpreting the outcome as a victory for socialist neoclassical economics. Then in the meantime, the more marginalized view by Hayek becomes more hegemonic successively with the rise of neoliberalism. Austrian economists such as Don Lavoie completely rewrite the debate, and the advocates of planning, our canonical gang of Devine, Leitman, Hanel, Cocktail-Cottrell, they retreat to more niche journals, like they kind of maintain the flag of planning, but in a much more marginalized way. Yes, I'll say something about the more recent wave in a minute. I'll just note here that I put down the name of Francie Fraser controversially. Is that not because she's really a protagonist of the most recent debate? I mean, she writes about planning. Like she says she's in favor of democratic planning. She thinks it's really important. It's certainly not the focus of her work, but I put down her name to kind of reflect. I think her work specifically reflects more recent ways of thinking about socialism as a more expanded way of thinking about what socialism means for social reproduction, for the safeguarding of nature, and for democratic politics, which I think is kind of looking at the recent crisis is very important. And those are also themes that are more important in the planning debate. Yes. Okay, so just a very rough summary to start us off. Jan, the next slide, please. Thank you very much. I'll say three things about general things about the socialist calculation debate. I think this is frequently done, but not always. We should really understand these debates as heavily influenced by historical context. So this isn't just some abstract history of ideas. That the first wave is really unleashed by the Bolshevik Revolution and by wartime planning. So Adorno having been directly involved in wartime planning and in the Bavarian Socialist Republic. At the start of the second wave, it had already become even more clear that laissez-faire Manchester-style capitalism was fundamentally flawed. Planning was becoming increasingly popular. The third wave in the 70s, 80s reacted to the overlapping contradictions of really existing socialism, of Western social democracy and of Southern developmentalism, this kind of high modernist planning of the post-war time. That became increasingly discredited. In the case of Western social democracy, kind of intensified planning didn't know how to react to stagflation within the paradigm it had created. Yes, in the context of our new debate is of course the poly crisis, the crisis of neoliberalism, the quickly escalating ecological crisis, the crisis of democracy, the crisis of the international order, and the crisis of social reproduction. So historical context matters a lot. The second thing I'd like to stress is that the history of the debate has given us a couple of important concepts that are still pivotal today. This includes the notion of incommensurability, the idea that a universal means of account like money creates problematic pseudo-rationality to compare things that cannot easily be compared. Another important concept is the idea of so-called tacit knowledge that is still important. The idea that certain forms of knowledge are embodied in time and place and cannot easily be aggregated by central planning agencies. So this implies local autonomy, but then in contrast to that, the concept of interdependence and subjective uncertainty by most importantly advocated by Maurice Dobb, but also followed by Pat Devine and others. They make the case for ex ante deliberate coordination of actions in contrast to just having irrationally isolated actors all act on their own and then only reveal the outcome of the actions after a market process. Yes. Third and final point about the socialist calculation debate. I think we can arguably identify three macro themes in the new debate. So that's how I think about this new debate. So the first would be the idea that planning is already endemic in capitalism, which is mostly associated with People's Republic of Walmart. Actually, the idea that the quantity and quality of planning secularly increases throughout capitalism can really be traced back to Marx and Engels. We find this in Ernest Mandel's writing in the 1980s. We can find it in the idea. We can find the idea in mainstream economists such as Schumpeter, Ronald Coase, Herbert Simon. We can find it in organizational sociology. It's really the departure point for organizational sociology, like the foundational myth. And we can find it elsewhere. Related to the idea that planning is endemic in capitalism is the notion that this planning, kind of the already existing planning, illustrates the capacity of digital technologies for post-capitalist planning. That notion can again be roughly divided into two ideas. First, the idea that real-time data from workplaces can be used to optimize planning via linear optimization, or more recently, the idea we can use artificial intelligence on one side, and then maybe more popularly, second, the idea that the increasing connectedness of the networked economy allows for cybernetic, bottom-up, horizontal coordination and planning. So we have this idea that digital capacities, so digital technologies create new capacities for planning, and then most recently, and probably more importantly, we have the idea that the ecological crisis creates a necessity for planning, and that this necessity can already be observed in recent turn to de-risking, new industrial policies, as the price system basically is struggling. So the price system being problematic in itself, but even the things that it can do are working less and less in the context of rapidly and tremendously transforming price structures. Okay, so next slide, please. Just to illustrate how those, I think we have to think about, so in a longer term historical view, we have to think about those shifts. So, and I think that nicely illustrated by kind of quotes from the time. So this is Joseph Schumpeter, Capitalism, Socialism, Democracy, first published 1944. This is probably at the early kind of hegemonic period of planning, where he writes that there is nothing wrong with the pure logic of socialism, which is kind of a fact he considered so obvious that it would not have occurred to me to insist on it, were it not for the fact that it has been denied, and the still more curious fact that orthodox socialists, until they were taught the business by economists of strongly bourgeois views and sympathies, failed to produce an answer that would meet scientific requirements. I think Hayek later blamed Schumpeter specifically for this book and for this narrative of the socialist calculation effect. Hayek blamed him, that he's the main reason that, or one of the biggest reasons that mainstream economists all consider the socialists to have won the debate. This is also, so you can also find this similar narratives with Paul Samuelson, other mainstream economists. But the idea really is that planning works. Of course, it works. We can see that it works. Look at catch-up industrialization. Paul Samuelson, in his 1948 first edition of, I think it's 1948. But don't quote me on that. It's introduction, the correct year. He kind of, so this is the most read introduction to macroeconomics, and he kind of established this moral dilemma that planning is obviously more productive, as we can see in the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union will catch up with the West in a couple of decades. But on the other hand, we like the economic freedom that we have in the West. So there's a moral dilemma for economists. So which one we choose, that's the narrative there. So planning is really considered very productive. It's considered that it's the future, it's what we'll have. That's the 1940s, 50s. And then in the next slide, we have Eric Olin Wright. So in contrast to a bourgeois economist, who even kind of in this quote mocks the left, we have a left wing, kind of one of the most famous left wing visionaries of the second half of the 20th century, Eric Olin Wright, who writes in Real Utopias, which was published in 2010. Comprehensive planning, whether organized through centralized bureaucratic institutions or through participatory decentralized institutions, no longer seems a viable alternative to most critics of capitalism. He kind of contrasts David Schweikart, his market socialism. No, Ernst Rimmer, not Ernst Rimmer. That's what was his name? Rimmer, first name. I forget. Rimmer's
John Romer.
John Rimmer. Thank you very much. I think Ernst Rimmer was a Nazi. Sorry about that. Yeah. So he contrasts that market socialism with basically Hanel's participatory economics. He's kind of indicating that both those. He's skeptical about those systemic alternatives. But he's definitely very, very skeptical about planning, these kind of things. That's kind of a thing we've overcome. So that really illustrates the shifting in the narrative. I think the reason, so if there's a pendulum that swings between markets and planning, it definitely is swung from markets to planning and back. And maybe we can understand this recent debate as kind of a start of the pendulum moving again, hopefully. Definitely hasn't swung completely the other way, but I think real world politics is indicating there's definitely something changing. Yes. Okay, so I'll close the section on the special issue just by very quickly saying something about the papers. If you're interested, they're online and you know how Sci-Hub works, or maybe you have a university account, or maybe you're interested in one that's open access. I think 2/3 or something like that are open access. So one contribution is by myself. It's called Finance as a Form of Economic Planning. And what I'm basically trying to do in this paper is kind of taking a couple of dispersed claims that finance is a form of planning in the planning debate, which I found very curious and interesting. There's also a couple of Schumpeter lines that I found very interesting, where he talks about finance as capitalism's Gosplan, and work by Ben Brown and others who talk about central bank planning, J.W. Mason, who talks about finance as the social planner of capitalism. And what I'm basically trying to do in this paper is to conceptualize what this means. So how does planning work in capitalism? So a kind of suggestion for how to conceptualize that, and what is the power finance within it, which is the power to provide or decline credit, the systemic power of finance. And then from there, I'm trying to build basically literature on bridges to the literature on financialization, which has argued that the power of finance, both in terms of financialized corporations, but also financial actors such as banks, asset managers, institutional investors, has increased and has kind of structured the way companies plan, for-profit companies plans, and also how states plan. And then also building a bridge to the democratization of financial literature, which I find very fascinating, which is more related to Eric Olin Wright, who was just mentioned, this Real Utopia project of ideas of how to transform finance and democratize it. Yes. The next paper is by Max Greenberg, Automating Away the Center. And it identifies 5 suggested strategies for static planning in the literature. And he argues that algorithmic mediation is the only potential candidate for dealing with high complexity. He gives a very interesting history of the historical background of optimal planning in the Soviet Union, and the structural shortcomings of Soviet command planning, and identifies 4 key challenges that optimal planners would encounter. And those are computational complexity, the need to generate the necessary economic data, the difficulty of reconciling static optimal solutions with dynamic real-world economies, and the question of whether an optimal planning framework can effectively address both the economic and political issues that plagued the Soviet system. I find this to be a very interesting paper because this is written by somebody who was very optimistic about this algorithmic mediations, but he is also very, very honest in some of his skepticism, and it's a way of he's making the skepticism very transparent, which I find very interesting. The next paper is a personal favorite by me personally, Niels Rochowitz. I think this is really important to have more work on innovation. I think we have some, we obviously have some ideas on innovation, but considering how important the notion, the discourse on innovation is for neoliberal imaginaries, it's very good to have somebody who's a scholar of innovation to systematically think about it. So Niels examines basically the coordination of interdependent investment via negotiated coordination by Peter Wind. He reviews the idea of investment councils and of mission-oriented innovation. And he builds on all of these, but he also goes beyond them. He builds his own model. He suggests that we could have accelerated democratic missions to identify demand for particular forms of innovation. So that's the demand side. And on the supplier side, he suggests a careful selection and screening of promising new technologies to fuel the supply side of innovation, where he's really suggesting that since most of, according to the literature on economic innovation, most of the innovations come from intersectoral developments. He says this is really, so this is something that we can really take from Mazzucato, even though there's a lot of limits to her approach, but this idea we should take seriously. The next paper is by who I refer to as Team Quebec, which I'm actually not sure works for all of you, but yeah. So this is by Sophie Elias Pinzonneau, Mathieu Dufour, Simon Tremblay-Papin. Very excited that you contributed. I'm not sure if all of you are here. I think at least 2 of you are here. Very excited about this paper because it's something that I'm also personally very interested in. The paper critically reviews models in the planning literature, but which is similar to what Niels is doing, but instead of innovation, the focus is on the international realm. The authors first review whether and how existing models conceptualize international economic relations, which is very valuable because it's something I think we really don't talk about, in which a lot of people who are sort of aware of the models aren't aware that there are such ideas. The paper then outlines a set of principles for the international relations of democratically planned economies. And those are autonomy, efficiency, multifactoriality, transparency, and cooperation. And the paper also illustrates how these principles could work in practice in the case of a small open economy, concluding that an international interface can be integrated into a multidimensional accounting system. Yes. 2 more papers. The first is on urban planning, which is another gap, and which is another very interesting bridge, I think, I would argue. So this is a paper about space and urban dynamics. Matthew Thompson, Yusuf Nisat Botero, both really interesting thinkers on planning, very well versed in all sorts of critical literature, very familiar with lots of different theories. They highlight a tendency in the planning literature to prioritize overcoming abstract labor time over abstract space, because they come from this kind of open Marxist value theory perspective. And they argue that this hinders a full understanding of capitalism's urban manifestation and its potential transformation. By considering recent critical discussions on the logistics revolutions and the logistical state, they suggest that post-capitalism planning will emerge from urban struggles over everyday life. So that's their kind of empirical focus. Final paper, I'm not gonna read out all the names. The paper is called Cyber-Physical Decentralized Planning for Communizing. The authors present a decentralized planning framework based on insights from value form theory and commoning as an alternative to both central planning and markets. They conceive their model as a cyber-physical system aimed at coordinating production and distribution without reliance on money or other capitalist social forms. In doing so, they offer a tangible technical blueprint for a prospective society founded on principles of communal ownership, polycentric coordination, and shared resource allocation. Yes, I think that's it from my side on the special issue. So yes, I'm gonna hand back to Jan.
Okay, thank you so much. I have the pleasure of presenting our edited volume, Creative Construction, Democratic Planning in the 21st Century and Beyond. And this is what it looks like, even though the title is still the old one, I think. We switched from planned economies to democratic planning. The book will be published early next year, namely in February 2025 by Bristol University Press with within the Alternatives to Capitalism series. And this is the structure of the book. It opens with a foreword by Kohei Saito, followed by an introduction by Christoph and me. And then you will find 3 parts structuring the book. Part 1 is called Blueprints of Desire. Part 2 is Building Bridges. And part 3 is Non-Boundaries. And finally, then after that, there's a conclusion by Christoph and me, which closes the volume. The book aims to be an interesting read for those who are new to the debate, as well as for those who are already fully immersed in it, as I imagine this audience probably is, I guess. And it provides introductory texts, but crucially also engages in the expansion of the debate, pushing further crucial topics that need to be addressed and examined more closely. And there has been a renewed interest in democratic planning in recent years, with a strong engagement with the canonical literature on the one hand, but also a plurality of editions, critiques, and developments. And for some years now, there is a very lively debate going on about how to think planning differently. And we see this book as a definite outgrowth of this very welcome development. We chose the title not only because of the playful provocation in the direction of creative destruction, but also because creative construction indeed is what we need. There are numerous well-crafted and insightful critiques of capitalism. This book, however, focuses on the construction, development, and imagination of desirable alternatives to capitalism rather than the critique of existing conditions. It does so not to dismiss one for the other. We will surely need both, but simply because one, the creative construction of scalable alternatives, is dramatically underserved compared to the plethora of rich critique. Developing such alternatives is constructive, not only because it aims to go beyond critique, but crucially also because the struggle for the alternative is itself always already a process of constructing different social relations. It is creative because it understands this construction as a continuous process of democratic deliberation and coordination. Creative construction is not really about having a plan, but about planning together. And since we have 17 chapters, I won't be able to get into all of them, but will instead give you an overview of the 3 parts with occasional references to individual chapters. So the first part of the book is called Blueprints of Desire and is based on the conviction that engaging with concrete models of democratic planning is an important element of making plausible that the desire for alternatives to capitalism can indeed be fulfilled. Contrary to the infamous and long-standing Bilderverbot within the left, we believe that proposing a multiplicity of tangible approaches as possible elements of desirable alternatives opens up a necessary debate instead of closing it down. By engaging with different proposals for organizing the reproduction of society democratically, and therefore necessarily in a non-capitalist way, the chapters in part 1 open up a space for critical debate about how we want to live together differently in concrete terms. And as I mentioned before, we have in part 1 introductory texts like chapter 1, which provides sketches of the 4 canonical models: multi-level democratic iterative coordination by David Leibman, Paracon by Hennell and Albert, negotiated coordination by Adaman and Devine, and computerized central planning by Cockshott and Cottrell. And since these models are still very important reference points for the debate, this lays a solid foundation for the reader to dive into the more detailed engagement within the following chapters. Heyer, for example, uses his analysis of the models to carve out basic problems any democratically planned economy would have to find answers to. Chapters 3 and 4 bring forward a strong critique of wage labor, with Muldoon and Booth arguing for an unconditional social dividend, and Zuttalutti and Meretz equally arguing for a fully voluntary constellation in their model of communism. And then there are two Foucauldian takes with Nick Dyer-Witherford's Biocommunism and my own chapter on planning as an art of government. And part one closes with a shortened version of a conversation I had with Yevgeny Morozov in the context of my podcast, Future Histories, a really worthwhile conversation, I think, in which Yevgeny argues that the planning debate should not so much focus on questions of static allocation, but instead think more about non-market mechanisms of bringing about the new, something, as Christoph already mentioned, Niels Rochowitz engages with in his fantastic paper he wrote for our special issue. Planned economies of the 21st century, they cannot and should not fall from the sky, but crucially have to be a product of extensive experiments in alternative practice in the here and now. In a prefigurative sense, the alternative projects of today lay the groundwork for futures in which this alternative practice has become the new normal. The contributions in part two take us into the present of disruptive movements and prefigurative practice and ask, how do such transformational politics relate to the contemporary debate about democratic planning? How could they be linked even further? The chapters in this part interrogate struggles around care work, public housing, and public policy, and ask where the inherent paradigms complement or contradict a transformation towards democratic planning. They provide in-depth knowledge of existing movements like Bärfelder and Möller in the case of Expropriate Deutsche Wohnen und Co., or Winker and Neumann in the case of the Care Revolution. And they engage with respective points of connection as well as points of suspicion or disagreement between these movements and the topic of planning. In short, the authors of part two of the book engage in building bridges between the contemporary discourse around planning and the movements without which any vision of desirable futures would be mere sandbox games. Part three focuses on putting front and center what Nancy Fraser would call capitalism's social, ecological, and political background conditions of possibility, namely social reproduction, non-human nature, and political institutions. These all arose when the emergence of capitalism broke up feudalism's traditional livelihoods and thus divorced production from reproduction, society from nature, and economy from polity. Capitalist laws of motion render these background conditions invisible and treat them as infinite, but the system at the same time crucially depends on them. Such a perspective expands the question of how to replace market society via democratic planning by an additional question of how to make sure such a transformation empowers all groups that never had equal access to the market to begin with, and it adds non-human nature to the equation. Varieties of democratic planning that do not wish to perpetuate the exclusions and destructions inherent in capitalism thus need to center on questions of care, care for people, as well as care for more than human nature. The contributions of the third part therefore discuss how democratic planning can abolish the gendered divisions of labor and universalize caregiving without romanticizing housework, for example, in the chapter by Heide Lutosch on caring in a liberated society. Durand, Hofferbert, and Schmelzer show how forms of planned degrowth can move beyond ideas of infinite growth and resource extraction. And Samia Mohammed aims to develop forms of post-sovereign planning in a critical engagement with Promethean tendencies within the planning debate. And part three closes with Christoph Sorg interviewing Nancy Fraser on how to expand our notion of post-capitalism and democratic planning in order to create visions of a better future that don't subjugate identity politics and political ecology to class politics or vice versa. So we hope by now it has become clear that while on the one hand, the popularization of the debate still is an important factor in what still has to be considered a somewhat niche discussion, it also needs to be of central concern for the debate to expand its horizon and deeply engage with certain blind spots the debate has carried along for way too long. We have already pointed towards different elements of how to think differently about democratic planning, and we would now like to use the final part of our presentation to highlight some of the fields that need, at least in our opinion, an extra dose of creative construction in order to bring about approaches that are able to step out of certain paradigms that arguably need to be overcome. So what follows in the next slides is not at all exhaustive, but instead wants to highlight certain fields for subsequent discussion. And with this, I hand over to Christoph.
Sorry, wasn't able to unmute myself, but now it worked. Yes, okay. So I'll have two thoughts. One on kind of broader politics of academia again, and other kind of research that we can build on. And but the first one is building on what Jan just indicated. This framework by Nancy Fraser. There's of course other authors that have suggested conceptualizations of those issues. I'll build on Nancy Fraser's one, because I think that one is particularly fine-tuned, and it explicitly talks about democratic planning, so it already has an interface for our work. If we understand capitalism as the emergence of capitalism as the breaking apart of the more integrated lifeboats of feudalism, where production and reproduction, for instance, are still relatively integrated, then we can understand, can look at a process of institutionalized demarcation, of differentiation between different spheres. I'll elaborate what this means in a second. But basically, if we think about a first demarcation between the owners and the workers, who are both divorced from any other means of reproduction than competitive markets. So this is a kind of first demarcation. We have the workers, we have the owners. Then we have those are in the workplace, but also different workplaces are separated from each other, which is the anarchy of the market. As different workplaces make isolated decisions over production and investment, and then only later have the market process reveal whether these decisions were correct or not. If we think about the capitalist economy in this way, the kind of as a class separation between workers and owners, and on the other hand, as an anarchy of the market, we kind of have the classical elements of a post-capitalist mercenaries, which would be first overcoming the conflict between the owners and the workers via workplace democracy, overcoming the separation of workers from their means of subsistence via distribution according to needs, and third, overcoming the irrational anarchy of the market via socialization and planning. That would be one way of thinking about this. I guess there's kind of different ways, but I'm just trying to illustrate this kind of classical agenda. The market socialist solution, I guess, would focus on this first point, on the workers and owners. The advocates of democratically planned economies focus on at least on 1.1 and 3, hopefully also on point 2, which would be this kind of divorce from the means of subsistence. But this expanded, I guess, I'm not trying to say that not all of those are very important, but if we think about capitalism as this kind of broader perspective of not only this economy, but also this economy being separated from spheres of social reproduction, of non-human nature and polities, there's some other issues that come to mind that kind of are brought into perspective. So this would reveal a couple of additional, just as important issues that I think advocates of planning have sometimes not paid enough attention to. For instance, the separation of social reproduction from the capitalist economy. So this institutionalized demarcation produces the marginalization of social reproduction. It doesn't mean we should romanticize care work, but it is something that works as this kind of buffer, this shock buffer. And it's also related to the gender division of labor. The separation of human from non-human nature is constitutive of extractivism, of anthropocentrism, and of intergenerational injustice. And the separation of polity from economy finally contributes a second element of planning. So we can think of those yellow dots. It's my illustration for companies. Very pretty. They are isolated from each other. There's this idea that this classic idea, right? That they make isolated decisions, and one way of thinking about planning is how to kind of have them relate to each other differently. But there's also, that's one element of it. The other element is of how does the political commune and the economy, how do they relate to each other? That would be, in my mind, that would be two elements of how we can think about planning. And then, in addition, the demarcation between economy and polity within one country and the demarcation of distinct political territories from each other in the international state system. They segment workers and citizens according to race, ethnicity, and citizenship. That would be in the framework of Fraser-Bergman. But there's other issues that come to mind. So who's a citizen who belongs to a certain territory, and how do different territories relate to each other? Yes, the general post-capitalist perspective on these issues is to overcome status-based, gendered, and racialized hierarchies, to live within planetary boundaries, reparations for past injustice, and so on and so forth. But so this is, I guess, a broader perspective on what post-capitalism should look like. But specifically for democratic planning, I would argue the task for post-capitalist society would be to liberate over how to transform, move, or abolish those demarcations. The point would be that not all of those, maybe those institutional those demarcations are present in post-capitalism. Maybe they're not, but that's a matter of debate. Maybe those spheres relate to each other differently. Maybe the demarcation is placed somewhere else. Maybe it's porous, and so on and so forth. But this is an issue of this is a theme of democratic planning. This is something that needs to be decided. I'll try to elaborate a little bit what this means in the example in the next slide on in the case of social reproduction and the anarchy of the state system. I think the separation, the boundary between human and non-human nature, what this means, what this boundary means, how it works, we against this background of this question, we can interpret kind of disagreements by Jason Moore and Kohei Saito, for instance. So how do they relate to each other in capitalism? And in general, what is this web of life? How does how is human are humans kind of just completely embedded in non-human nature? Are those separate spheres that are interwoven? The way those are questions of the way of we think about how those spheres relate to each other. And of course, in the planning debate now, the ecological question has received more and more attention. Unfortunately, questions of social reproduction and international relations have not received significant attention as well. But yeah, we have a couple of chapters in the third part of the book that Jan just summarized. I'd like to just illustrate some of the themes that I think arise from a specifically democratic planning perspective. Democratic planning of social reproduction would probably imply deliberation over the boundaries between households, community, and society. So kind of what are the rights and the responsibilities of different segments, different spaces. For instance, we could think about, if we think about caring of children, should that be conducted in households that ideally have transcended the family form, and that may look like a plurality of kind of households? Should that caring be conducted in kind of communal care structures, or should it be conducted in public childcare facilities? Ideally, we get to choose freely, but even there, I think in the Paracon paper by Böhmer, Sabina Chowdhury, Robin Hanel, I think they really grasp this issue, because if we think about mandatory school education at a certain age, a society might want that. So you also got to deliberate how much do you get to choose freely, and at which point do you not get to choose freely? There's not a clear right solution. There's a caring in the household might be desired by certain groups, and having access to public spaces might be desired by others. Of course, it's more kind of work effective to have this done more collectively. But there's, of course, not all of this work can be conducted outside of the household, and people might not want to. And whether this is acceptable or not, this is all of those are questions of deliberation and of rule setting. Yes. We can think about this also if we think about a transformative trajectory of overcoming the androcentrism that's inscribed into current caring. We can phrase as suggests, I think, a very interesting way of thinking about this that is kind of illustrated by the models in the planning debate. So she says, if an imagination of post-capitalist reproduction, she doesn't use that language. I use that language. Those imaginaries, we can think about this in a term of way of universalizing non-household labor. So what is now wage labor? There's an image of this should be the universal norm, which is of course what happened. What liberal feminism is about, but also what feminism and state socialism was about. So basically, get rid of everything should be done outside of households. This is the liberatory sphere is what we now have as wage labor. So we, as much as caring work should be conducted in childcare, elder care facilities, and so on. There's certain arguments for of course for public care facilities, but there's also certain downsides. We could think about the reverse image of empowering households to conduct as much care work as possible, of basically taking the burden off them, giving households more space. Certain community services that's already suggested by Diane Elson in a kind of rebuttal in the 80s, which has a lot of potential. But Fraser also phrases that it's this kind of idea that not women being pushed to become like men, but men being pushed to become like women in this gender coding of contemporary care work. So the idea that it becomes normalized that we do part-time work, that for some certain periods we don't do wage labor at all, if there's still wage labor, and so on and so forth. So that's a second trajectory that we can imagine. It's more in the commons literature. Also, some of it is present in the Paricon model. Yes, that's a certain second imaginary. And the third one would be that we create a certain parity. It's the idea of maybe tokens or credits today for household work. That's a third one. But all of those have certain downsides and advantages that I can't get into. And the point is, I guess, there's not a clear solution of the best model. This is something that has to be negotiated. Yeah, sorry, I'll end it here. Happy to talk more about this in the discussion, but I think I'm getting sidetracked. Okay, so final thing, just very briefly, maybe also in the discussion. If you want to learn more about this paper in the paper by Sophie, Mathieu, and Simon, you can learn about this also in my book chapter. The idea that there's not only an anarchy of the market, there's also an anarchy of the state system. And this isn't really talked about. So what already Otto Neurath remarks that if you have democratic planning in a world market, so he's writing that in the 1940s, you might kind of democratic planning in a single country, embedded in a world market, that may reproduce certain tendencies towards monopoly power. If certain resources are located in one country, they have a certain kind of leverage that others don't have. There's a certain kind of methodological nationalism in planning debates where we think about state and we don't think about the state system. It poses a lot of questions, but we can kind of divide them into questions for transformation and to questions of a kind of more long-term view. So this kind of idea of socialism in one country that reemerges. How does democratic planning work if there's only one country that attempts to do democratic planning, or there's only a couple of countries? What's interesting is that democratic planning would be, if you look at the literature of delinking, collective self-reliance, counter-hegemonic blocks, democratic planning is the precondition also. If there would be a path, you need democratic planning, because that means you need a deliberate strategy to shift your resources to survive in such a situation. And then what would democratic planning look like on a world scale? Should we imagine that we have a cockshot control country, a Hanel country, and a divine country, and they all like experiment with different models, but then do they exchange with each other? If yes, how do we avoid core periphery dynamics, regional inequality, military conflict, and so on and so forth? Those are questions that are really important. How much time do we have left? Jan, I'm going a bit too long, right? I see you smiling, and that's what this means. I'll skip over this slide a bit because I don't think it's as important. I just want to remind us that there's really interesting debates on the new industrial policy and less Eurocentric on the new state capitalism. That some of the protagonists, they're following our planning debates, and they're very interesting in what we do, and I think we should also be interested in what they do. There's a lot of macro social theory on differentiation, on rationalization. For instance, James Scott seeing like a state. What's his name? Timothy Mitchell's work also, where there's a very interesting history of rationalization, calculation, and planning in history that we can relate to and turn planning into a theme of academia. There's the classical urban planning literature. And we can learn a lot from social movement studies on social transformation. I'll skip over more details here and hand back to you, Jan.
Well, thanks a lot. So when it comes to broadening the scope of the planning debate, one might say that it should simultaneously become more abstract and more concrete. And I think it needs to become more abstract in that the debate needs to critically re-examine and enlarge its theoretical foundations. And I will point out some of the areas that I believe should be examined a bit more closely. However, I have to warn you pretty clearly that these are mostly questions I myself have towards the debate at large. I unfortunately do not have the answers to these questions, but instead wanted to use this opportunity here to hopefully engage more people in thinking about these topics as well. I'm very much keen on hearing your ideas on this maybe afterwards. So I think it has been of great benefit for the fourth wave of the planning debate to engage with the models for comprehensive planning that have been brought forward in the early 90s, the canonical Big Four. However, I also believe it to be an important development to leave the narrow corridor that the debate around comprehensive models sometimes confines itself to, in order to provide a perspective from which the debate itself can be critically examined and developed beyond its comfort zone, so to speak. Such a critical engagement does not aim to prove individual positions as wrong and is definitely not directed against works that stay within the canonical corridor, the bread and butter of the debate, so to speak. But it argues that if one wants to provide comprehensive alternatives to capitalism and neoliberal governmentality, and this should be an underlying goal, a decisive broadening of scope as well as a critical inspection of foundational assumptions is needed. Many of the models carry along implicit and unquestioned presuppositions that remain unaddressed in a quite problematic way. For example, certain anthropologies already mentioned separations of spheres, instrumental relations to nature, as for example in the notion of a good Anthropocene, and so on and so on. And I just want to point out two very much related fields that are, while being quite fundamental to the topic of democratic planning, I would say still are very much underexplored. And the first one has to do with markets as sites of veridiction. I would argue that central functions of markets within liberal governmentality, namely the function of markets as sites of veridiction, are not taken into account sufficiently within the debate at large. And that leads to insufficient conceptualizations when it comes to providing alternatives. With reference to Hayek's information problem, a pretty common take within the debate is to highlight the role of markets as a decentral mechanism of information processing, followed by an appeal to develop mechanisms that would be able to provide this aspect of markets for a socialist economy. Some approaches then emphasize the role of technological developments to do the job. Others emphasize the need for partial local autonomy in order to address this information problem. However, while the Hayekian information problem certainly should be taken into account, and while technological advances indeed do open up new realms of possibility regarding distributed information collection and processing, it would nonetheless be a crucial mistake to think that this would constitute the most difficult part in overcoming the market with a capital M. In my chapter on planning as an art of government, I highlight a very different challenge for any approach that seeks to provide comprehensive alternatives to the market, namely its role as a site of veridiction and production of truth. For if we look at the role of the market in neoliberal governmentality, then the market not only restricts sovereign power by defining a realm in which government should not intervene, but it also indicates what constitutes good and what constitutes bad government, thereby creating a state under the supervision of the market rather than a market supervised by the state. It does so through the naturalization of prices as signals of truth and the implementation of market competition as a structuring principle not only of the economy, but of society as a whole. And crucially, the political sphere also relies on this production of truth for the legitimization of their actions as well as their inactions. And looking at the market as a regime of truth and technology of power in such a way brings up very different challenges for anyone interested in providing comprehensive alternatives to its function. It shifts the debate from discussing a problem of production and distribution and its derivative problems of information and calculation, as well as incentivation, to the question of production of truth as a rationale of government. And Wendy Brown quite hits the nail when stating neoliberalism is secured by virtue of a government rationality in which the veridiction of the market, its truth principle, establishes it as both ontologically incontestable and ubiquitously applicable, even as its actual dynamics are unknowable. So that's, I would argue, what we are really up against, not information collection, but quasi-divine entity. This is where the self-immunizing quasi-divine nucleus at the heart of neoliberal ideology, at least in its US-American variant, comes into sight. It is simply not possible to refute the market in its function as a producer of truth through revealing it as a lie, since for neoliberals, it is precisely the fact that the truth of the market escapes human judgment that makes markets such a supreme mechanism in the first place. Otherwise, we could have had democratic economic planning from the start. So the important question then becomes, does the debate around democratic planned economies succeed in providing rationales of government on this level of abstraction? What are the alternatives to the market as a site of veridiction? And well, that's easy, you might say. Why all the fuss, Jan? We'll do it democratically, dummy. And yes, at first glance, the answer is, of course, simple. Isn't it obvious that it should be the democratic will of the people that takes the place of the market as a site of veridiction? We are talking about democratic planned economies after all. And that is, of course, true, but simply stating we will do it democratically is not really a sufficient answer when faced with what might, in reference to the information problem, be called the veridiction problem. For if we do it democratically, the question arises based on what? And this question, based on what, is not so much geared towards the practical design of the democratic process, which in of itself is its own huge field of inquiry, but it instead asks for the points of reference of such processes themselves. If the market currently serves as a reference point for politicians of all kinds of persuasion to say no to the populace, what then are the reference points within models for democratic planning? The reference points within models for democratic planned economies to say no. The yes is obviously the easy part. What are these signals of truth in a democratic planned economy if market prices aren't supposed to provide this function? And here, I think two important elements come into sight that form the double Achilles heel of the planning debate. First, the notoriously difficult field of evaluation and limitation, and second, the equally difficult question of subject. As a debate that is concerned with democratic planning, I think it would be fruitful to engage more deeply with the question of what notion of subject is actually underpinning the democratic part in all of this. And there is a feminist critique brought forward by Heidi Lutosh when it comes to the assumed subjects of Daniel E. Saros's model, as well as the assumed subjects within communism. And I would add that also someone like Pat Devine and his model of negotiated coordination needs to be critically looked at from this angle. Devine, on the one hand, extensively highlights inclusive participatory processes and the need to involve as many affected actors as possible. So at first glance, there's a lot of variety. Yet on the level of subjectivities, this plurality collapses into an implicit imperative to be a very specific subject that he describes as an autonomous, self-activating, self-governing individual. And I think if we look at this formula, autonomous, self-activating, self-governing individual, the question arises if this conceptualization of subjects is really able to step out of an already omnipresent way of governing subjects within liberal governmentality. And I personally would say, no, it doesn't. And all this is to say that there is a need for a decisive broadening of the debate to include a reflection not only of the techniques and practices proposed in comprehensive models of democratic planning, but also of the underlying knowledge formations, implicit subject positions, and truth claims they assert. But I said in the beginning that the debate needs to become more abstract and more concrete at the same time. And I think it's absolutely time to develop and engage in real-world experiments that try to bridge the theoretical debate with prefigurative practices that already exist today. And for me, there's a personal element to this. Maybe I think I just recently finished my PhD, as Christoph already told you, and will use the coming months to think about the next projects I really want to engage in. And as someone living in Vienna, I always thought that with its rich history of both planning and socialization, Vienna might be a city that is open for experiments in democratic planning. We'll see, and I'll keep you posted on this. Let's see. Others are also aiming in the direction of concrete experiments as well. Maybe Christoph wants to say something about that later. Let's see. And very much in the spirit of the second part of our book, any such experimentation is crucially dependent on continuing to build bridges into movements and to develop ties to relevant institutional actors. And we can say that for the German-speaking debate, this is indeed happening right now and working quite well, I would say. And also in Austria, organizations like ATTAC, for example, have developed an active interest in democratic planning and are actually organizing events around the topic. And in general, one can say that the responses are very, very positive. The time when people were shocked by the notion of democratic planning are definitely times when people were shocked by the notion of democratic planning are definitely over. There's room to build something beyond the niche, I would say. And in order to make best use of this opening, I want to argue for a more concerted effort around building new collective imaginaries. Democratic planning as the kernel of such alternative imaginaries provides a quite convincing framework for addressing the multiple crises that we collectively face. But I would argue that we should more actively engage in constructing a broader imaginary that also aims to positively capture the imagination of broader public notions, notions such as freedom and security. These have been successfully co-opted by the right, but I believe they should very much be central elements of imaginaries of attainable futures that can be brought about through democratic planning. And in this positive spirit, let me end with an example for a very concrete and productive way of combining very concrete fights in the here and now with a larger perspective engaged in questions of democratic planning. And this example is a socialization movement and campaign around housing in Berlin called Deutsche Wohnen und Co. enteignen, or Expropriate Deutsche Wohnen und Co. Rabia Befelde and Philipp Möller have provided a really great chapter on this campaign for our edited volume. And Expropriate Deutsche Wohnen und Co. fights to socialize the assets of private landlords who own more than 3,000 flats in the city of Berlin. So basically investment firms that own houses. And it's a huge and highly successful campaign, which already won a referendum in the city of Berlin in 2021. Unfortunately, this referendum was subsequently ignored by the political apparatus of Berlin. And currently, the campaign is in the process of writing a law, which will then be part of a second referendum. And if this goes through, then the law is binding and will need to be enacted. And this would mean that affordable housing will again become a reality in Berlin. And what you see on the right is a brochure created by Expropriate Deutsche Wohnen und Co. that lays out in quite some detail how the socialized housing assets will be transformed to a democratic public body governed by a council structure with tenant participation. It clearly defines the modes of democratic participation and control that will serve to maintain and improve the housing units in a proper way. So this is a very, very concrete example of planning understood as the collective social reproduction in the sphere of housing, a project that is feasible in the here and now, and that lays at the same time the foundation for further expansion into varieties of planning. And with this, I'd like to thank you all for your attention.